interesting too. Not much research has been done on cannabis. As soon as we give them far red light at the right moment, at the right intensity, we can see that the development of flower induction, so the transitioning from vegetative growth to flowering, goes quicker. So normally in cannabis, you can see you change the photo period, but still for 3-4 weeks, it keeps growing a bit and slowly the flowers develop. Maybe by giving far red at the right moment, it goes quicker into flower development, shaving off 1 or 2 weeks from your harvest time without affecting yield. So it's
We're Jug Dealers, we're the podcast you need in your feed, teaching the game like you never seen. Jerin, Gabe, GRAMBO, true OGs, masters of the globe, set your mind free. From Denver, Colorado, where the data's green, we set the data points for the SOPs. Jug Dealers Podcast, yes indeed.
Hey everybody, we are back here in the Jug Den to do the Jug Dealers Podcast, where we talk about everything lifestyle and cannabis related. I am here to announce, due to unprecedented demand, and these are good problems to have, we are forced to have opened up a Gen 2 for the Jug Club. Gen 1 sold out basically immediately. We turned around, we talked to management, we decided, hey, can we continue to make this happen? Can we open this up again? And we got a yes, and we're going to do Gen 2. We're going to open up another set of memberships. Again, that's $20 monthly. You get a 20% discount always on the website. You get exclusive access to our community content. You get behind the scenes stuff. You get Jug Dealers After Dark, strain reviews. So please go and get your membership if you haven't already. Jugdealers.net. Hit the Jug Club tab. We'll see you there. And we are actually here for our part 2 of the Mex trilogy. If you didn't catch part 1, we'll talk about it right off the bat. Go check out the PhD, the Cannabis PhD video. You can find that one pretty easily. And then that would be the part 1 of what will be our trilogy with very special guests that we have in here. Dr. Mex, and tell me again how you say your last name. You guys, these Dutch guys, it's always so hard to get these names and these words and such right.
It's most of the G, right? It's pronounced Holweg.
Oh, yeah. Wow. That does not look like that.
Most of the.
Yeah, a lot of that's in there. Glad to have you back, Mex. We obviously just got back from having a couple of very good business meetings. We flew over and saw you guys over on your side of the pond, and had some really good meetings, and looking forward to continuing all these partnerships forward. And it's just lovely to have you back. So we are going to I think we laid it out a little bit the first podcast, and just talked about really getting people to know you, then really talking a little bit more specifically about, some glasshouse history and artificial lighting history and where it's been and where it's going, which is really where we're at here in part 2. And then part 3, going to bring up a little bit more about, specifically some of your work, and your dissertation and UV and cannabis and, and also again, really furthering the technology and where some of your research is going to go and things like that, just to give everybody a little tidbit. I would like to say too, obviously go and check out everything that we talk about at jugdealers.shop. You can get all of our products, lighting stuff included as well. And you can see all the Jug Club stuff, sign up for our newsletters and all that good stuff. You can find it all at jugdealers.net. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get things started. And really where I wanted to start, as we had talked about, Mex, was really give everybody just a little bit of, the history of glass houses and really, even, to my understanding, where they really, really, truly started wasn't even from an agricultural standpoint. It was really more from a rich person preservation standpoint. They'd go around the world and collect these interesting plants and then want to bring them home and store them in a place like France or England or Holland or something like that. So why don't we start there and see where we get?
No, for sure. Super interesting, Jerin. Thanks for having me again. So I think when people think about the Netherlands, is mostly Amsterdam, but also red light districts, coffee shops, etc.
This is true.
But I think the greenhouses, very important part. And especially if you look at the history of greenhouses in the Netherlands, right? I think like you mentioned before the 1850s, most people were only having greenhouses for preservation of these exotic crops.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were mostly dependent on growing our crops outdoor in the full soil as soon as weather allowed it, right? So then after the 1850s, the first kind of greenhouses we had were actually just flat greenhouses, so single layer glass greenhouses that we put on top of, well, or cabbage or cauliflower, etc., all these kind of crops. And that was really the beginning of greenhouses. And slowly it developed into, well, greenhouse where you can actually stand in, where you don't bump your head
Right.
when you walk against the gutters. No, it really developed, like in all kinds of aspects, having a bigger air volume in your greenhouses, etc.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it really even started, from what I understand, really is almost like what we would consider a cold frame these days, right? Very much mostly in ground for insulation purposes, things like that. Maybe something where you would literally pick up and, for things like you're talking leafy greens, things of that nature, but then just little by little, and then actually quite quickly, it literally metaphorically grew up. And then, like you said, well, why don't we have it to where we can actually get into and 10 crops within it and grow bigger crops and create bigger air volume and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. Even like back in the day when we had like the single layer greenhouses, or the one you put on the floor, I think around the 1900s, we had almost 100 hectares or 100,000 hectares of these kind of glass houses.
Oh, wow.
And afterwards, it's quite a bit, right? But the first development, and then like you mentioned, then they go to warehouses where you can actually stand up in the greenhouses and even start heating the greenhouses too, right?
Sure.
And it's quite a funny like historical development we had in the 1950s, where they started heating the greenhouses. So first with like wood mostly, and with coal, afterwards with like gas. And what they saw was, okay, if I heat my greenhouses, I have like a higher yield of lettuce. And then they also find out simultaneously, like, hey, why does this happen? Well, when you burn these fuels, you also release CO2.
Right.
So you heat your crop, you give CO2, and the whole invention, the connection was made. Like CO2 is actually beneficial to the plants. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's funny how, a lot of those things, it's like sometimes are, quote unquote accidental, right? But it's, and we were even talking about, a little bit about, without, giving up too much, but how a lot of the research that you're doing and have been doing is, I love it because it's so much of it's just proving what we've seen anecdotally. Something as basic as, with higher temperatures, you're going to see less terpenes because some of these volatile terpenes are going to disappear in a higher temperature environment. Just very basically speaking, right? And it's going, well, we've seen that before. Any grower's seen that before, but then to actually see the science to back it up. So I find it so interesting that throughout history as well, you had so much of this just observational, type stuff that wasn't able to be proven for, a long time. And, some of which may not have even still been proven, but they go, hey, this is interesting. Not only is it warmer, not only is it more comfortable in here, but this stuff's raging now. And whether for sure, right, specifically that it's CO2 or not, it's still like, it works either way, which I always find kind of interesting in a way too, right? I love knowing the background, but if you still can just observe it anecdotally and go, well, you know what, this is working, let's keep doing it. Same in a way.
No, for sure. And I think definitely also specifically looking at the Netherlands, we're such a small country, right? And all our greenhouse area is like located in the west of the Netherlands. So below The Hague and next to Rotterdam, very small area.
Okay.
And we don't have much area to expand, right? So we have to be very efficient at producing as much as vegetables or any harvestable crop per square meter. Right. So it also made the growers over the years just invest more into efficiency, because we can't expand and the people who live there didn't want to move somewhere else. So how can we actually increase this yield per square meter, right?
You're right.
So, yeah, this really drives technology, innovation.
Right. It truly drives the innovation. And that is something I think that maybe a lot of people don't understand, is that obviously the Netherlands is a small country, but even smaller is the area where, most of this research is actually being done. And in fact, even from the air, you'll see it it's just kind of this one very, very concentrated area. But also I'll say, when I've been in there, where I've been really, just surprised is the high level of efficiency. You only see, human labor in very specific areas like end packaging or, beginning planting or things like that. And then it's like everybody just disappears and they just let the plants do their thing. And that's one of the things I like to talk about, us not being growers, right? We're just plant janitors. We're just putting it in the right environment and letting the plant, do its thing. You just don't have people all over the place, which is one of the things where I think, we talk more and more about, even in commercial cannabis production, the too much of a high reliance on labor because, unit prices were such that you could just bring in that high level of hand labor. It didn't matter. Now, if you're growing tomatoes, on the other hand, and you're talking about maybe a few cents, per kilo profit margin, well, then you're going to have to run pretty efficiently, right?
No, for sure. And surprisingly, because they work with such big area, such big yields, even these small margins make like a big difference, right? But eventually you have to become more efficient and cut out, like you say, the major costs,
right?
Which are or lighting or labor. So we really go into, automation in this era, mostly automatic harvesting, etc. Even with tomato now, normally you have to remove the stem as it grows along the gutter, basically.
Right.
Also, systems are being developed where the stem is being cut automatically, so it can stay in the same spot. So everything to reduce labor, right?
Right. And like you said, 1% on 100 hectares. Sure, that's a lot. 1% on 1,000. Well, that's quite a bit more. 1% on 10,000. We're talking huge numbers, right?
Hey guys, today's show is brought to you by JugDealers.shop. You want to grow the best cannabis possible? Head over to JugDealers.shop and get something like our Ruby Fulvic. It's going to give you more efficient uptake on your NPK. You could also try our Winter Frost to increase secondary metabolite uptake and improve your cultivar's flavor and phenotypic expression. Or finally, grab some Cocoa Blocks to save time and money. This is how you can support the show, and it keeps us going. We're never sponsored. We're 100% funded by you taking your garden to the next level. Head over to JugDealers.shop and get something to help your cultivation thrive. Now, back to the show.
And on 100 hectares, sure, that's a lot. 1% on 1,000. Well, that's quite a bit more. 1% on 10,000. We're talking huge numbers, right?
Yeah,
it's that exponential growth. Yeah, there you go.
For sure. And with cannabis, it's way easy to explain, right? Because it's such a valuable crop. So we can be more innovative. We can try more new technologies, and because we can also afford it.
Right. And historically, that's definitely been true. I think that's definitely less and less true every day because you do see, an evening out in the market or more of a direct link to its actual value as opposed to its perceived value being a black market crop. Right. So it is still easing into this white market understanding that there is, there's obviously going to be, and I don't know what that real, a true fair point is and what it should be a price per pound. But I'll tell you, people are trying to find it. It's been up to, very, very high standards. And then it's been, very, very low. And in reality, it's got to be somewhere in the middle. But those high efficiency standards we're going to see continue to become, more and more the norm as opposed to the exception which is what it's been kind of up to this point. Now, let's segue a little bit, being that you are the lighting man. Obviously, very, very, in not too long a time, but also rather, if you think about it in the course of, our history, artificial lighting is really not that old, right? I mean, for the longest time, it was just these glass houses to preserve environment, to lengthen seasons, things like that. But there was nothing to really add any more light or manipulate the sun or photo period until what? 1950s or so. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think actually the US was one of the first to really investigate supplementary lighting, right? So in the 1920s, you had the United States Department of Agriculture who investigated supplementary lighting. Because before we were all depending on solar radiation, right?
Sure.
And what if we grow a crop? We want to have continuous growth, but we need to control the photo period. So how much light does the crop get before it starts flowering? So what can we do? We can move these plants to investigate the photo period to different latitudes or cultivate in different seasons.
Sure.
Or we can block the sunlight or we can add sunlight, right?
Right.
So I think Alan Gallard from this United States Department of Agriculture, they really investigated supplementary lighting for the first time to control flowering at least.
Interesting. So they had some understanding that the light had a direct impact on flowering or inflorescence or fruit production or whatever. Interesting. That is obviously understood. And but before that, it looks like I'm thinking what HPS is around the 1950s, and before that, it was basic fluorescent tubes is about all that would be available, right?
Yeah, exactly. Before that, they had like low pressure sodium lights, which are also fine for growing, but way less efficient.
Right.
HPS lights being introduced in the 1950s by Philips for the first time, single-ended HPS lights, and eventually to double-ended HPS lights, which are more efficient, higher light output. Also, like these high-pressure sodium lamps, they had a better spectrum than the low-pressure sodium lamps. So the spectrum shifted a bit more from yellowish, a bit more towards amber, towards the red region of the spectrum, which we know by now is one of the most beneficial light spectra for plants to absorb and do photosynthesis.
I get it. Interesting. And I mean, if you really think about it, fluorescent tubes all the way up to the current LEDs we have and beyond and everything else, the technology all happened within 100 years. That's pretty wild to think about. Yep. That's been a quite a lot of innovation that's happened in the scope, the scope of things in quite a short amount of time. Well, why don't we back up just a little bit? And I'd love for you to kind of step these folks through, just some of the lighting basics, because I think, things like PAR and PPFD and DLI and some of those things can be, it can be a little bit confusing at times for folks. And a lot of times you're talking about, the same thing, but getting to it in multiple different ways. And I think for some people, that's a hard concept to get. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. And I think even also in science, we don't always agree on which terminology to use, which one is correct, and it's being debunked the whole time, right?
Right.
So I think beginning with the most easy definition is PAR, photosynthetically active radiation. So that was determined by McCree back in the day, the same as McCree, the LEDs also. That basically says between 400 and 700 nanometers, so between blue and red light, are the photons that are that are photosynthetically active and determine plant growth. And this we can define in PPFD, which is the synthetic photon flux density. So the amount of photons being emitted onto a square meter per second. And this is what we need to know for plant growth, right? But even then, coming back to the whole PAR story, like PAR is only between 400 and 700 nanometers. This doesn't take into account that, for example, red light drives photosynthesis more efficient than blue light, and blue light is more efficient than green light. It all equals one photon is the same. And this is technically true, right? As soon as a photon gets absorbed by the leaf, enters the chloroplast, and is promoting photosynthesis, one photon, if it's blue, green, or red, doesn't matter.
Right.
But they get absorbed in a different kind of way. Yeah.
Interesting. No, that's actually, you put that very well. And like you said, but it doesn't tell the whole story, right? Even the 700 or the 400 to 700, that doesn't talk about far red, that doesn't talk about UV, that doesn't talk about other parts of the spectrum that may be not technically, I guess, what the plant's absorbing, but that could be initiating other things that are going on, correct?
Yeah, no, correct. And that's why I come back to what scientists said before, right? They're always debating and into discussion what is right. And we have PAR light, but we also have a new definition that was proposed a couple of years ago by Bruce Buckby in Utah State University. Mm-hmm. And they investigated how does far red light also contribute to photosynthesis. And what they see, if you give far red in addition to PAR, and that's important to mention, because if you only give far red light, it doesn't drive photosynthesis. But if you give far red in addition to PAR light, it drives photosynthesis in the same efficient way as if you give blue, green, and red. So that's a new terminology, extended PAR, EPAR. Now also a study from Wageningen University, one of my colleagues actually, they investigated UV light. And we have UVC, UVB, UVA. And when we consider UVA light, which is very close to blue light, especially UVA1, this is between 340 nanometers and 400 nanometers. This can also drive photosynthesis. And in comparison to far red, this can drive photosynthesis by itself. So without being complementary to PAR. So we're always figuring new stuff out and debating, should we change the terminology? But indeed, yeah, not only 400 to 700 nanometers drives photosynthesis.
Right. So it's an evolving definition, I suppose, depending on what information we have. How about DLI? You want to talk a little bit about, and not Dutch lighting innovations, I mean daily lighting interval. You want to talk just a little bit about that? I think that's one of those things that gets overlooked a little bit, and maybe a little bit misunderstood.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. It's a beautiful name indeed, Dutch daily light interval. But I think this is also something that we should change in science, because now if you read a paper, for example, right, you only read about the treatments in PPFD, photosynthetic photon flux density. But this doesn't tell me anything. Eventually, I want to know how much light does the crop receive in a single day. And this is where the daily light integral comes into place. So this is the amount of moles per square meter per day. And if you remember from before, we mentioned PPFD is micromoles per square meter per day. So if you times 60 times 24, in this case, not times 24, but the photo period, the amount of time you give light.
Sure.
Then you know how much light a single crop gets on a single day, right? And this means way more than PPFD, because eventually, PPFD, if you give it consistently, it doesn't matter if you give more light in the morning or more light in the afternoon. Usually DLI is the most determined for crop yield. Right. So if you give me the DLI, then at least I can relate this to crop yield.
Sure. Now, and again, I've even seen this. I did a little experiment one time myself. I said, well, you know what? I think my plants are getting plenty, within 8 hours instead of the 12 hours of light I'm getting it. So I gave it 8 hours of light and 16 hours of darkness, thinking whatever, as far as phytochrome red, phytochrome far red, everything that I knew, this should work out, right? Reality was I had to run it about 2 extra weeks to get it to the finishing point that I wanted. As I went back and counted up the hours, guess what? That was about 8 weeks worth of running it at 12 hours was 10 weeks at the 8 hours, right? And it kind of started looking at it almost like chilling units, right? It's like sometimes you need just that certain amount. So that would also lead you to believe that if you could stack the light in the right way, you could get an earlier ripeness by doing a similar thing, correct? Although you couldn't go too far, right? Because of phytochrome red and far red, obviously, and you have that photoperiod aspect of it. But man, but if you had my head's going wild.
No, very interesting point, man. What you mentioned just now about the chilling days, like we discussed light the whole time, but eventually light promotes plant growth. It doesn't determine plant development, right? Plant development is controlled by the temperature. And if you give more light, or if you have a longer photo period, your plant temperature, we call it the heat sum, right? The amount of heat that builds up over the plant over a prolonged time determines the developmental rate. So if we have more light or we have a higher temperature, then development goes quicker indeed. Yeah, for sure. Well,
and it's one of the things I always like to emphasize is that, any little things that's changed, it doesn't change one thing. And especially, in plants, whether it's nutrients or whether it's environment, it's really a land of ratios, right? It's not any like, it's all this, right? Like you were saying, far red without any par, and it does nothing. Now, interestingly enough, if you go on the other end of the spectrum, you can find a spectrum that does initiate it without the accompaniment of it. What does that mean? I don't know, but it's interesting.
I agree. I definitely agree, man.
So this actually kind of takes us a little bit into, the next thing I want to talk a little bit, which was about spectral manipulation. And we've kind of already been touching a little bit about that, but, talking about, red and blue ratios, and even talking a little bit about, green light, right? There's this thought that green light isn't used for photosynthesis, and you can use your green light to work with in your grow room, which anecdotally we've seen does work. And maybe you can speak on that a little bit, why in and of itself, without the accompaniment of red and green, it doesn't do anything, but it is actually used in the course of, photosynthesis.
Yo, what up, Jug fam? Didn't want to interrupt the show, but you guys know what it is. Every week, we do a shop giveaway over at jugdealers.shop. Someone is entered automatically to win a prize. This week's winner is Eric E. from Michigan. Eric, you win a 125 ml bottle of the Rhizium, the Root and Shoot Initiator. That is good stuff, my friends. Guys, if you guys want to be a winner just like Eric, all you have to do, go over to jugdealers.shop this week, buy anything, and you're automatically entered to win. Congratulations to you for winning. And guys, I'll see you over at jugdealers.shop. Back to the show.
That a little bit why in and of itself, without the accompaniment of red and green, it doesn't do anything, but it is actually used in the course of, photosynthesis.
Yeah, where to begin? You want to begin with blue light, green light?
Yeah, I know. Okay. So why don't you just talk a little bit about red and blue ratios and really even the manipulation in that and why, that is so important, or even, crop specific, right?
Yeah. I think that also is one of the main reasons that drove the innovation of LEDs and transitioning from these conventional horticultural lights like plasma, fluorescence, HPS, etc., towards LED. So we can have full control over the spectrum at specific phases of development, right?
Right.
So what we know, at least looking at a photosynthetic perspective, red light drives photosynthesis in the most efficient way because it gets directly absorbed by chlorophyll B, chlorophyll A, the main photosynthetic pigments within the chloroplasts. Then we have blue light, which is a bit less efficient because it also gets absorbed not only by chlorophyll, but also by these pigments that are not photosynthetically active, right? Like antioxidants, etc. And then lastly, we have green light, which is, people always said, the least efficient because, you see the leaves, right? They are green because they get reflected the most. But it is only a very small part still, only slightly less efficient than blue light. Then the benefit of green light is actually it goes deeper into your crop. So when you work with a very dense canopy where you have high light intensities, usually most of the light gets absorbed by the top canopy and it can overexcite the photosystem. And then the plant becomes less efficient in utilizing this light for plant growth. But if you have green light, it goes deeper within your leaf. So within the leaf, it's called the detour effect. It basically bounces off the different chloroplasts and utilizes the full leaf, but also delves deeper within the bottom canopy. And this is especially important because when we read papers, we always consider photosynthesis on leaf level, but we never look only at one single leaf, right? We care about the whole crop.
Right.
And if we can increase photosynthesis also in the lower leaves, which usually don't get any light and they don't produce that many sugars for plant growth, they mostly consume sugars to stay alive. Yeah, you can use green light to actually benefit whole crop photosynthesis. And that's only from a photosynthetically active perspective, right? If we look at plant development, and this is where the interesting things come into play. Because you as a grower, depending on your cultivation system, is it like multiple layers? Is it like a high plant density or a low plant density? You can control the plant architecture by, manipulating the spectrum, right? If you have more red light compared to blue light, your plants become more elongated. So if your plant is more elongated, it's a less dense crop. More light penetrates within your crop, again increasing this whole crop photosynthesis. If you utilize blue light, in the beginning, for example, of your plant growth, early vegetation, you want a more compact plant and a bigger leaf area, that blue light can be more beneficial. But also blue light increases the amount of chlorophyll in the leaf, right? So if you have more chlorophyll in the leaf, it means we can utilize more light for plant growth. Also, the stomata, which are like the small mouths on the leaf, they open up more. So through here, more CO2 can enter the leaf, which is also beneficial. If you give more light, make sure more CO2 can enter the leaf. Otherwise, it's pointless.
Right.
And I think lastly, before I kept mumbling on nonstop, it's like far red.
Oh,
right?
this is great.
So far red is super interesting too. Not much research has been done on cannabis, but what we see in some ornamental crops that require a long night, so we call them short day plants. As soon as we give them far red light at the right moment, at the right intensity, we can see that the development of flower induction, so the transitioning from vegetative growth to flowering, grows quicker. So normally in cannabis, you can see you change the photo period, but still for 3-4 weeks, it keeps growing a bit and slowly the flowers develop. Maybe by giving far red at the right moment, it goes quicker into flower development, shaving off 1 or 2 weeks from your harvest time without affecting yield. So it's Yeah, many interesting things you can play with the spectrum.
Well, because, I've always talked a lot about, especially when you take any, with the photoperiodic plant, basically freak it out, taking it from an 18-hour, of light to 12 hours of light. Thing doesn't know what the hell is going on for a few weeks, And so I've always really, said that, like, really there's veg, there's flower, and there's a transition zone in the middle. And I've actually seen a couple of nutrient companies over the years that have attempted to address that transitional period, understanding that, part of even the plant stretching, it's going, I don't know what the hell's going on, right? But if you were able to give that signal to it faster, to get bud set going faster, you know what I mean? You would actually get it into flower faster, which would take more days off the end, because going back to that same thing like we were talking about, it only needs so many days of real flower time, right? So get it into flower faster, you're going to get to the end faster, more or less, right?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And even utilizing far red in the beginning of cultivation, right?
Sure.
What we also see in some crops, if we give some far red, we get more leaf expansion. And especially when the plants are small, right? You don't have a dense canopy. The faster your leaf area grows, the more photons, more light is being captured by the plant.
Right.
And the more exponential this early growth is. So there's so much potential. Well, still to be figured out.
Well, a lot to be figured out, obviously. Now, this is just kind of an honest question that's come up really in my mind right now. Do you think that one of the reasons that LED has become so popular so fast is because of this ability to stage specific tune the lights for not only different stages of the plant, but even different plants in and of itself? And the reason I say that, because yes, LEDs are more efficient to a point, but reality is over time and based on degradation and different things, there are shortcomings in it, right? But the fact that you can tune it so much from a science perspective, I understand why people want to do it so bad. And does that make sense?
No, definitely. I think there are multiple benefits for LEDs, at least. Like you mentioned first, the ability to change your spectrum depending on the growth phase of your crop. Also changing the intensity depending on, when your crop needs more or less light.
Right.
But I think more importantly now, what we see also in the Netherlands, right? Electricity prices are quite high. And what I mentioned before, the plant doesn't care about how much light it gets on a single second, right? It cares about the total amount of light in a single day.
Right.
So if you can change your intensity based on the electricity prices, you grow a more efficient crop, and it doesn't matter for the yield, the quality at least.
See, now
but also coming back.
Yeah, go ahead. No, keep going.
Okay. I think also what you mentioned with light degradation, like HPS is a very nice investment, and it doesn't degrade. Well, if you have a good type of HPS, maybe 2 to 3% of light output you lose per year. But compared to LEDs, you can run them for 100,000 hours, and maybe you lose 20% of light output, depending on how warm you operate your LEDs. Do you run them at a higher temperature because they're less efficiently built? They degrade quicker than when they're more efficiently built and run at a lower temperature, right? I think that's what we see right now, at least, also in horticulture and also in cannabis. The biggest reason why people switch toward LEDs, because it's over the lifetime, it's just better efficiency. Degrades less quick than HPS.
Right. No, it's an interesting diversion that we've gone in, in that technology. And you still, everybody, I did not want to interrupt the show. However, we need you to help us by taking your grow to the next level. Go right on over to jugdealers.shop and pick up some Slicium. Don't let bugs or a failed AC or a broken pump take your grow down. Get Slicium at jugdealers.shop. It is readily water soluble and uptaken immediately to thicken cell walls and reduce any and all abiotic and biotic stresses. Keep in mind, this is how we support the show. We are never sponsored. We are funded by you taking your grow to the next level. So to support us and your grow, head on over to jugdealers.shop and get yourself something real nice. Now back to the show. Diversion that we've gone in, in that technology. And you still, have people, obviously, and we talked about it. And even in, reading in your dissertation a little bit about a nod to the fact that, maybe at the end we could save some energy by, the plant not needing as much, or that there's obviously some different strain specificity, right? Because that's what's so interesting to me. It's like you can figure it all out. And then it's like, well, that was for that strain or that group of strains, right? Maybe it could be be a little bit more specific than just singular. Maybe it could be more equatorial, or I try and shy away from the sativa indica terms. But anyway,
it helps. It helps still.
It does still help. It helps group them, even though it's not as accurate. But again, that's an evolving term, right? But really, even going back to sorry, a light just went on, and I apologize even for interrupting, because a light went on, was like, holy shit. Really, in a way, that's what it is, trying to cram all the energy it's needed, but doing it in specific times to even pay less electrical rates based on what time of day it is, stuff like that. Now that's next level efficiency thinking, right? That to me is on a whole other level, right? Because it's really trying to harness that understanding of when and how that you can still get and maximize out and basically get to the point where you're flattening out the curve so you're not losing anything by just using simplified terms, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you mentioned before also, that you can reduce the light intensity towards the end of harvest, right? So in one of my studies, we measured photosynthesis throughout the day, but also throughout development. And there's a slight higher efficiency where the crop is able to utilize light more efficiently in the morning compared to late in the afternoon, but it's a very minor difference. So growers still steer on electricity prices instead of taking this into consideration. Makes way more sense. But especially throughout development, right? So as the plants become older and they start to grow flowers and go into senescence, so the leaves start to die, we see a drop in chlorophyll concentration within the leaves. And if we give like 600 micromoles of light or 1200 micromoles of light, and we measure photosynthesis on the leaf towards harvest, we don't see a difference. And this is kind of strange, because we know if we give less or more light, we have more flower yield, right?
Right.
But then what is the main reason that we see this lack of difference towards the end of harvest? Is it first because, maybe the flowers also contribute to photosynthesis? And this isn't strange, because the flowers are green, right? They contain
chlorophyll. Yeah.
Yeah. Or more beautifully, I would say, and I hope this is correct, that in the last 2 weeks of flowering, the flower mass is already mostly developed, right? So it's not gaining much more mass. Maybe we can actually reduce light intensity throughout the end of flowering without affecting yield or cannabinoids and terpenoids concentrations. But this is just hypotheses, right? This is something we have to test and see. There's loads of potential also here for energy saving.
Well, and maybe you could take it a step further. You could actually use that to preserve more terpenes, right? By actually reducing light intensity and temperature, potentially, right? So I think that got a lot of interesting potentials there. You know what I mean? And let's actually talk a little bit about this in, some practical facility science, if you will, because everything we've talked about, somebody in their head might be going, okay, so that just means more. Not necessarily, right? There is a point of diminishing returns. We are dealing with a C3 photoperiodic plant. With the C4 plant, that might be a different story, right? But we're, in by and large, in the horticultural world, dealing with C3 plants. So there is diminishing returns within PPFD, right? You're going to get a point where more light's not going to do anything else for you, correct?
Yeah, at some point. And that's the unique thing about cannabis, because you don't see tomato crops or cucumber crops going all the way to 1,000 to 1,200 micromoles.
Right.
But with cannabis is a beast. If you measure photosynthesis too, it goes all the way, and this is photosynthesis, right? All the way up to 2,000 micromoles, you still see an increase in photosynthesis. Although it's not as linear as in the lower ranges,
sure,
you still see it increasing. And even with flower yield, as soon as you can maintain proper temperatures, high CO2 levels, then this increase in light intensity still gives you an equal return in flower yield.
Right.
For many crops, we have this rule, and we say 1% light, 1% more light is 1% more yield.
Sure.
For cannabis, we can say 1% more light is between 0.6 and 0.8% more yield if you can maintain the proper CO2 levels. And that's quite often the limiting factor, right?
Right.
Because we don't have enough CO2, or we have enough in the environment, but it doesn't enter the leaves as quickly as possible. Coming back to spectrum manipulation, make sure you have enough blue light in your spectrum to open these stomata to complement the increase in light with the uptake of CO2.
Right. And that's, I love how you're talking about that, and just as a systems-based concept, right? Because I even like to talk to people about, VPD is really more of a concept than a hard and fast rule, right? Obviously, if you think about it, you want to keep the stomata open because you want to keep the straw rolling. You got to keep transpiration rolling. If you don't keep transpiration rolling, nutrients aren't coming in. Everything's got to work as a system, right? And looking at it as, everything's working on a law of the minimums, right? Although sometimes that can be for, an amateur, rather difficult to ascertain what's a true minimum, which is why we kind of tell everybody just try and give the best averages you can on everything and throw a softball down the middle, right? But as we get to do some of this research, we actually get to look at some of this stuff. But I also find it so interesting that it's like, even if it could take more, can we ever cram enough CO2 in there, for example? So in theory, on paper, it's like, yeah, it could keep going, but then in a horticultural environment, is it doable, right? So it's that trying to kind of meet that science, right along with, the actual, practical end of doing the work itself, and understanding that there is, an effect on everything. You know what I mean? Light's an integral part of that. And that's why, in my hierarchy, light and environment are tied for 1 and 2. Those have got to be so intertwined and so integral together that without that done, everything else is just, shit. It's going to fall apart. You know what I mean?
No, definitely. I think it's a whole system, like you say. You can't increase one factor without complementing with the other two. Increasing light intensity heats up the plant temperature, causing more evaporation of the plant too. And then what you mentioned before, the VPD, right? If you have a too high VPD, so it's basically how much how much the air is sucking out of the plant. Like higher VPD allows for more vapor to be taken up by the air. If it's too high, the stomata close, your plant temperature rises to the roof. So everything has to be in balance, but it's a nice system.
And I love VPD as, again, as a concept. Now, I'm not so sure that anybody, in fact, I know it, nobody's really come up with the VPD for cannabis though, right? We know the VPD for lettuce, let's say, but are we growing lettuce? Are we growing plant matter? Or are we oil farming, right? So that's what I find interesting too, is like and that's why I tell people to run as a concept, don't try and run the chart, because the chart may not really be, proper for the plant or what we're really trying to do or what's of horticultural significance. Again, as a concept, I think it's wonderful because you have to think of it as a systems-based concept. If you do it as a religion, you might end up with some problems. Plus, you're just going to go crazy trying to keep that damn number right on the line. It's going to be, it's going to be problematic. But I want to also go back real quick. Like the fact that cannabis can take just that obscene amount of light. What do you attribute that to? Do you attribute that to the touch of man and are just, us throwing a ridiculous amount of light to it? Because I find that very interesting. And how could that happen, over what would be considered possibly a relatively short amount of time? You know what I mean? Because we don't have that much time that it's even been around artificial lighting, as we've kind of, as we already figured out, we got 100 years worth of artificial lighting and that's it. So it's like, how the hell did it get to a point that it can take so much light?
I don't think it's so strange, to be honest. Like if we look back at where cannabis came from, the Tibetan plateau.
Sure.
So high altitude, not much clouds cover, etc. And considering in the full sun without cloud, we can have 2,000 micromoles per square meter per second, right? Which is insane. So having long photo periods after, cannabis spread from the Tibetan plateau to the Mediterranean.
Sure.
Long photo periods, no clouds. It was already genetically adapted to withstand these high light intensities. And then indeed, like man controls, eventually we breed for certain aspects.
Sure.
So over the years, we breed for bigger flowers, etc. And cannabis is a beast that can deal with these kind of plant crops. Heliophytes, we call them. Helio, sun, phytes, love them. There are many like this. And cannabis is definitely a heliophyte. Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Any other, do you have any other examples of a heliophyte? And that's actually a word that a term that I've never come across. So I love it. Learned something new today. Heliophyte.
No, I think also tomato technically. So tomato can also withstand very high light intensities. The thing is, it doesn't have the same return on yield when you increase the light intensity.
Right.
So it won't die with too much light, but it's just not worth in putting 1,000 micromoles or 1,200 micromoles into tomato.
Sure.
For cannabis, for sure, apparently, yeah.
Well, and so I guess, if you think about it too, really like any row crop, right, is bred to be able to go out there, sit out in the sun, right in the middle of the sun, in a field for its whole life. It doesn't have the protection of living next to a tree or something nice like that. So, you got to figure anything can live its life out in, full sun in a field is pretty damn tough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's why you got to. That's why you got to give it up to plants. Well, let's before we get out of here, let's look a little bit about where you see the future of cannabis lighting, kind of where things are going right now. Even some of these like AI-driven light recipes, some of the things that I think there's a lot of work that can be done rather quickly with some of the technology that's out there, and then of course, with that too, it's more cutting edge fixture design, all that kind of stuff. Do you want to comment on that a bit?
For sure. Not sure where to begin, but I think there are many interesting parts, right?
Right.
Well, first of all, I think dynamic lighting is quite an abstract term, but like dynamic steering in light intensity and spectrum, depending on the plant's need and the goal the cultivator wants to achieve. But I think most importantly is when we grow cannabis, like you mentioned before, we grow oil. We don't just grow food, right? In the beginning of plant growth, we want to make sure the plant grows as fast and healthy as possible. But eventually want to like slightly stress it out to increase these specialized compounds, cannabinoids, terpenoids. And if we keep the plant in a too comfortable environment, we can't really stress these compounds out and have like higher concentrations. But we already know if we create this controlled stress, like dry bags, reducing the moisture content within the substrate overnight, it stresses out and it creates more of these trichomes. I think also stressing the plant out by utilizing UV is the next step in increasing these cannabinoids and terpenoids. Then again, not so easy. And I think we can also delve into this later. UVB, UVA, UVC. At what moment of the cultivation, in which ratio compared to the par? There's loads of progress to be achieved in that section, I would think.
Perfect. Well, you gave us a nice little a carrot to dangle out for part 3. That was perfect because that is what we're going to get into. We're going to really get into really specific, more specifically your work, your dissertation, and where you really think some of that's going. Specifically the UV, specifically the DLI UV that we have, and some of the stuff that and testing and results that we're seeing. But I find all of this talk to be super interesting. And in fact, I'll give you another little shout out too. You're also doing some other. We're going to be, you're basically doing some write-ups that are then accompanied by some videos. One that you just did on crop steering, right? I know you got a little bone to pick with that particular, it's just not with the action, but with the terminology, right? And so I love actually going through and breaking down, all these things and really like, is bro science, if you will, bad or wrong? No, but I think it's mistermed a lot of times. And we talked a lot about that. Like the intention or the understanding is all there, right? It's like, and it's all in the right direction. At times though, it is misnamed, which then gets confusing, I think, in the future, because even something like crop steerings is as little as picking your pot up and is it heavy or light enough to water it. To me, that's crop steering, right? But I think some people think it's this very specific alleyway, but in reality, it's a broad term. So you are going to be going through doing a lot of these write-ups and whatnot. So be looking for that stuff. We'll definitely be posting all up. Thank you so much for coming out again, Max. You'll be seeing stuff. Yep, Hortimetrics. You'll be posting on there as well. And until next time, that is part 2 with Dr. Mex. Thanks again for coming out, buddy. Really appreciate it. That was a heck of a chat. My mind's ringing. I got a lot of things going on now. Thank you for that.
Always, man. I think we need 1 hour more, but thanks for having me and looking forward to the next edition.
Sounds good, buddy. We'll talk soon. Cheers, guys. Till the next time from the Jug Den.